time we went into talking about the birth stage, the vast majority of what we've talked about is what we call the conception stage of getting ready to plant a church, understanding the calling and having a sending church and sharing your vision with other churches and getting your own goals and strategy and vision and all that stuff in place. But last week we started talking about that birth stage when you actually start the new church. We talked about, do you do services, just start out with a Sunday morning service, or do you do more of a Bible study or even a small group format? We talked about several different ways to gather people, different things like door-to-door and different advertising efforts and things of that nature. Some people have done some things that they call like fishing pool situations, and like maybe they'll have the missionary moves into the town where he's going to do the work, and he might have a neighborhood barbecue, and just invite like his neighbors over, just want to get to know you guys and have a barbecue, and then whoever comes, try to build a relationship with them, and then try to repeat that as you win new people, try to repeat that where they're at, and have you be one of the people that they invite. So there's just lots and lots of different, ways to go about it. But we're ready to talk about a meeting place. I don't think we talked about that very much last time, a meeting place. And the thing about it is when you first start off, you're just going to probably be renting a place. You might, some people have started in their house. And if you're starting with a small group or the cell group Bible study concept, that might work perfectly fine, just to meet in your house for a while. Other people have, met in like meeting rooms, and these can be found like at the library, or some motels have like conference rooms, and so some people met in that type of situation. Another possibility is to, and these situations here are just kind of time of service kind of situations. And another possibility is to have something that's yours all the time to use, and that's where situations like a storefront comes in, or maybe in an office complex. That's the kind of situations that might work out there. I guess another one that's pretty common up here is like a school. It's just time of meeting, but a lot of people use schools to get started. Another interesting one that would also just be time of meeting would be Seventh-day Adventist churches. They meet on Saturday, and I've heard of several situations where a person has rented it on Sunday, and the church has been willing to rent it to them on Sunday. So, a lot of different situations. I think that if you're trying to do a church service, this becomes a little bit more important. If you're doing a Bible study, you're kind of doing a word of mouth, people inviting people thing anyway. And, you don't want it to be like a really bad neighborhood or, hard to get to, super hard to get to or anything. But it's probably not, the visibility is not quite as critical. There's basically two things that are real important in meeting space. And one is visibility, and the other one is accessibility. And so you want to be in a situation, the ideal situation is to be visible and to be easily accessible. But again, depending on what stage you're at, the level of how important that is varies. It's very important in your permanent building, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But at this stage, it might not be quite so important. In fact, at this stage, accessibility is probably more important than visibility. You know, it probably doesn't really matter if especially if it's just times of meeting only, you're probably not even going to get to put a sign out or anything. So it won't matter in that situation. And what happens is a lot of people start in this situation, then they graduate to this situation, then eventually build their own building. Of course, some things to kind of think about in these renting situations is, you know, just size. How many people are you going to be able to fit into this situation? You know, if we're meeting in my living room, well, we can squeeze in 12 people. If we're meeting, you know, in another kind of like conference room setting, we can get 40 in there, and kind of think about both what you feel is going to happen and what your goals are, and size is important because you want it to be big enough. But I've also found that you don't want it to be too big. Because if you've got this room set up for 100 people and 10 people show up, then people feel like, oh gosh, you know, there's not very many people here. Whereas you take that same, and sometimes it's how you set the room up. You can take that same situation, put a table right in the middle of it, and put 15 chairs around it, and then it seems like a lot of people came, you know, because most of the chairs are full. So you want to balance that out. You want it to be as nice as possible. You know, you don't want it to be a dump. You want it to be as nice as possible. That's where, if you're going to use your home, that puts a lot of work on your wife, you know, because she's, not that it's overwhelming, but, you know, she's got to make sure things are clean and tidy. And these other places, you know, one of the things, there's got to be a balance as far as money is concerned. You don't want to, you know, just be cheap and try to figure out how you can do this with the least amount of money possible. But at the same time, you don't want to be wasteful either. And I think that I've seen some situations here recently where people are tending towards the wasteful, you know, where they're thinking, oh, we got to do it, you know, top notch, we got to have the best, and, you know, they spend, I mean, I know somebody spent $3,000 a month, and what they got for $3,000 a month was a meeting space that they had on Sunday morning for 3 hours, and, you know, it was nice for sure. And then next to it, kind of like a little office, storefront, like office complex that had 3 rooms. So they could have office there, and then they had a room they could use for Bible studies and stuff like that. Well, man, $3,000 a month is a lot of money. I mean, you could be, if you can afford to do that, you could be socking some money back for a building, you know, in the future. So, you know, just if it's justified, and you know, maybe there's some areas that are so affluent that if you don't do something like that, people would be uncomfortable in any other setting. And so maybe spending the money is justified. But, you know, you just gotta, and the only way you can figure out that balance is, you know, the Lord's help and the direction of the Holy Spirit. But you can go too far one way or the other and end up in a problem. And something that we did that I think was a positive thing is we had the local people pay the rent. So we didn't ask for any outside help with our rent. And I felt like that accomplished two things. Number one, it kept us within a reasonable means. And number two, from the very start, it showed them some responsibility, not anticipating that, all these other churches are just going to shower us with money and we're not ever going to have to worry about anything. But hey, this is our responsibility. We've got to do this. And, when you stop and think about it, when you first start out, even if that just means that it's your giving that is paying the rent, well, that gives you a measurement then of where you can be on that. Or if you're blessed to have some seed families and, you can kind of figure out, yeah, this is what we can afford. And I remember when we started in Columbus, that we started in a conference room, and we met there for about 6 months, and then we went to an office complex that was more, that we had it all the time. But that move took us from $150 a month to $800 a month. And so it was a significant move, and we had to make sure that we could, afford it and that we could do it. But so most go through that transition from just the time of meeting to something we have all the time. Then the next one is their permanent building. And I think that through doing this 3 times, I've learned some valuable things from making some good decisions and making some bad decisions about buildings. And the number one thing that we've got to be very, very careful about is debt. We have to be extremely careful about debt, especially if you're planting the church with outside help. If people are helping you financially from the outside, it's awful easy to think, well, we could probably afford to do this because we got X amount of dollars coming in, so on and so forth. But what you really need to do to the very best of your ability is, again, just look at it as if the local people are going to have to pay for this. Now, it's been interesting, there's been different theories on this. I think the common way of thinking for our association of churches is, let's send a guy there, let's support him fully, to where he can work full time. Then as the work grows and shows a certain amount of progress, let's get them into a building program, and let's build them a building that probably will be sufficient for a couple hundred people. And let's try to get that building paid off, and then have that church be on its own. They should be able to pay their pastor at that point. And ideally, that's a good situation. That's great if we can do that. But the thing of it is it doesn't always go picture perfect. There's not always just this, in 5 to 7 years we accomplish that. Sometimes we do. In fact, several times we do. But it doesn't always work that way. So what happens when you start getting far enough along the process that contributors start saying, well, how long is this going to go on? Are we ever going to organize this thing? Are we ever going to see it stand on its own 2 feet? So that's kind of the most common way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that no, we're not going to do anything to help them with a building. We'll help get the man there, and we'll keep him on the field for X number of years, but during that time frame, they're going to have to figure out their building situation on their own and get to where they can pay their pastor and take care of that. And then a less usual, I mean, I haven't heard this very much, but I know of a church in Texas that always has looked at it this way. They send out a missionary, and their main objective is to get them a building. The missionary has to take care of himself. He goes and he gets a job, and if the people there locally can start paying him, then that's fine. And this particular sponsoring church in Texas looks at it as if the hardest thing for them to accomplish is going to be get a building. So that's what we'll do. We'll help them get a building. We'll raise funds from our sister churches to help them get a building. But when he first goes, he'll have to work a job, and once the congregation builds up enough, then they'll be able to pay him. And they never do anything towards the guy's salary. That's all on him and the local people, that he's trying to reach. Well, and part of the thinking is he'll be more motivated. If he knows he can't just sit there and still get paid, then he'll be more motivated. Now, of course, for me, I don't have any problem paying the guy, but if he's just sitting there, I'm going to stop paying him. I'm not going to just sit around and not let him do anything. But it's just different thoughts and ideas about how to go about it and what the potential is. But when we get, no matter how we're doing it, when we get to this permanent building stage, we've got to be very, very careful about the debt, because one thing that can really cripple a church is debt. And I've seen that, I've experienced it. Even some well-established churches have done this to themselves by going into debt. And when you get into a situation where it takes, a third or a fourth of your budget to pay your building payment, you're in a difficult situation, a really difficult situation. And you're missing out on a lot of other things that you could do that would probably be more beneficial to the work. And what's the causes of people getting into debt like this that we're talking about? Well, I'd say that overdoing it when they build is one of them. Just kind of building everything you want, and you can't always have everything you want. Sometimes you got to take what you need, and later on you can have what you want. And another thing is the idea of, I only want to do this once. I might have to be building every few years, so I only want to do this once. So we're just going to go ahead and build everything that we think we'll need and not have to. Well, that's a great strategy if the money's available and it's not any problem. But if you're going to have to rack yourself up in debt in order to only do it once, then that's probably not the right way to go. Not a good idea. And all these decisions, again, are made by how the money is coming in. I know of a missionary here in our state who I think has a very nice building, and it was a tremendous investment on the front end. And even since then, as they've done things to make it more what they want it to be, it's been a tremendous investment. But this particular missionary had a sponsoring church that gave $3,000 a month to their building needs, not even considering what they did to make sure their salary was raised. So take everybody else out of the equation, no other churches, nothing, just their sponsoring church alone gave $3,000 a month. Okay, well, if you know you're going to have $3,000 a month coming in, for sure, of course nothing's for sure with churches, but pretty stable, pretty sure that money's going to be coming in. Well, you can afford to make some decisions about, well, maybe let's go ahead and get make sure we don't have to do this every time we turn around. Maybe you can afford to make some decisions like that. But if you're dependent on just several different churches giving money and, just hoping that they'll contribute, man, you better be careful. So I prefer to look at it as the local people are going to have to do this. And I think if you look at it that way, unless you just know that you've got an ace in the hole somewhere kind of situation, you'll keep yourself out of trouble if you look at it that way. You don't think, well, our sponsoring church will do this or all the other churches will do that. You just think, okay, what if we had to pay for this? What's that mean? What's the debt load going to be? What are the payments going to be like? And you make decisions that way. A good way to, the best way to avoid debt is just don't borrow any money. That's the best way to do it. Brother Rod Shaw, he's been over there in Ohio and has done a good work, for several years. But they still don't have a permanent building. They've got land and they've got a temporary, like mobile building on that land, but they don't have any debt either. They have absolutely no debt. So, you kind of get into this situation of saying, well, if we had a building, that would really draw people and that'd really make a difference, if we had a building. Well, building's a good tool, no doubt about it. But I think if we feel that a building's just going to really ramp up what we're able to do, we're probably not thinking exactly straight. Now, again, there's exceptions to everything. If you're currently meeting in a rat hole, then a building might greatly improve, the people that you can reach. But my suggestion would be, so just, we're not going to borrow any money. That's the easiest way to avoid debt. But few do that, and I've never done that. I've always borrowed money in building church buildings. But raise money up front. And what I mean by that is get yourself into a situation where you're going to have the ability to put a lot of money down. And so, my mentor, Brother Cossey, he always said, raise a third of the money on the front end. Then, he said, you raise a third of it while you're doing the building, because that's the peak moment where everybody's excited. It's actually happening. You raise a third of the money while you're building, and then the last third you can finance and pay it off. Well, that's great. If you can do that, that's a pretty good plan. So if you have built a $300,000 building, then you end up owing $100,000 on it. That's not too bad. But one of the problems that I've seen over the time period that I've been doing this is cost has skyrocketed. And things that we used to be able to do for just a little bit of money, it's just not possible anymore. When I went to Edinburgh, there was already a building there. We added on to the building. We added about 1,200 square feet to the building, which was an extension of the auditorium. Totally renovated the auditorium, put all new padded pews in it, which at that time was the big deal. That wasn't, everybody didn't have padded pews, that was a big deal. And anyway, the whole thing, and we had about $22,000 into it, to do all that. So then, move on and go to Columbus, and of course, that's another factor, is geography changes the price of things. Some land and buildings are definitely more expensive in some places than they are in others. And even to some extent, building materials are more expensive in certain places than they are others. It's not a big difference, but there could be some difference. And so we go to Columbus and we pay $185,000. By the way, the work in Edinburgh never had that. Now everything, paid for everything as we went. Even the guy before me paid for everything as he went. But there was a lot of excitement, there was a lot of momentum, there was a lot of positives. And they met in this old 2-story house for a long time before they bought property and started building. They actually followed this plan. It just so happens that they raised more than a third before they started, and they raised the rest of it while they were building. So it was one of those kind of moments where everything was there, and it came together. But when we went to Columbus, we bought 3 acres of ground and 2 old houses for $185,000. We spent $45,000 getting the 2 houses to where they were attractive and met code for public meeting spaces. And then later, for another $150,000, built our first phase building, which was this auditorium that would seat 200 and a couple of bathrooms and a foyer. And so the price difference between the amount of years that had passed and the location was pretty extreme. Then went to Nineveh and spent $500,000 to build a building, to buy land and build a building. And so, and all these numbers with a lot of volunteer labor, a lot of volunteer labor. And so, it just cost a lot of money to build a building. That's all there is to it. In fact, I have noticed that in the last 10 years or so, that you can usually buy a building cheaper than you can build a building, even with the volunteer labor. Of course, the thing about buying a building is it in a location that you think is a good location, and is it, structured, is the floor plan such that's going to work out, for you, or work out for a church, Sometimes you can find an existing church and purchase it, but why did the other people move out of it? Because it was too small and didn't meet their needs? Well, if too small was because they were running 500 and had to move out, then okay, maybe you're going to be fine. But if they were running 100 and had to move out of it, then before too long, you'll be in the same situation they're in. Or, is it a rat hole? Just what's the situation with the building? So if you can find a church building, sometimes that's kind of a nice match because it was already used for that purpose. But a lot of buildings we've found have been like warehouse buildings and things like that could be converted into a church. And that's what Brother Kenny Robertson did in Seymour, is bought a warehouse building. A warehouse building and converted it into a church. I went and looked with Kenny at that building, and he told me what they were asking, which was like $560,000, and they bought it for $475,000. And I told him, and it was over 10,000 square feet, 10 acres of land. I said, Kenny, there is no chance. Even if you pay what they're asking, you can't build this for what they're asking. You simply cannot do it. And so then as time went on, they moved into part of it and used it. And then as they grew, they fixed up another part of it and moved into that. And so it's been a really nice situation for them. But you've always got to ask, is the money there? And I'm not, and the thing about debt, especially nowadays, is not only how much difficulty does this put me in, putting myself in this debt, but also, can I even borrow the money? Is it even possible for me to borrow the money? Things are tighter now than they've ever been. And probably the chances of the new group being able to borrow the money is very slim. They've got very little financial history. It's just very slim unless you've got somebody of means in the congregation that's willing to put their name on the line. you're probably not going to be able to do it. And then, so that backs it up then to the sponsoring church. Are they able to do it, and are they willing to do it, to go into this debt? Another option, which is the one that we used, is we borrowed the money from private individuals rather than borrowing the money from the bank. And that did two things for us. It gave us a better interest rate. They were willing to give us a better interest rate, which, maybe that depends on who you borrow from, what they think about that. But it also gave us a little bit more leniency of, we had some situations where we needed to buy something to kind of finish the building off. And I was close friends with the people we borrowed the money from, and I talked to them about it, and they said, well, just skip the payment the next couple of months, don't worry about it. And then after you guys get that bought, then, pick back up with the payments. And so it wasn't that big of a deal, there was, because of the relationship, there wasn't even a contract, it was just my agreement with them, yeah. So, of course those guys gave us that money knowing they could lose it, not thinking they would, but knowing they could, and of course they're in a situation where that wouldn't even put a dent in their financial situation. But on my side of it though, you want to be responsible. You don't want to say, oh yeah, we just borrow it from these individuals, and if it doesn't work out, oh well. No, that's not the way you want it to be. You want to do the right thing. And so, we've always tried to do that. So, what I'm trying to say is what the Bible says. Be careful about this. This is a bad deal. Be careful about this. One of the things that, the church at Edinburgh, during the time that I was there, and for about 8 to 10 years after I left, it did really well. But then it had several challenging things happen and really started going down. Well, all those lean years where they had 20, 30, at one time all the way down to 4 people, what kept it going was there's no building debt. If they had a building debt, the bank would have said, this is our building, get out of here. But they didn't have that. And so without that debt, they could survive and they could go on. One of the things that ended up putting it into jeopardy is that under the leadership of a pastor, they put a parsonage on the property in which they went into debt for it and put the property up as the collateral for it. And so that's when they came to a kind of a desperation point where they had to get some outside help to, keep from losing it. So this is a very, very dangerous thing. My recommendation would be to not build too soon. I feel like in Nineveh we built too soon. I also feel like I'm not sure we had very many options. But I felt like we built too soon. And another don't is don't build too big. We also did that in Nineveh. We built too big. And our thought process was some of these things down here. Let's just go ahead and we don't want to have to do this, again in a few years. And at the time that we were going into our building program, we were growing and things were coming along pretty good. So you got high hopes and dreams and visions of how things are going to work out. So it all made sense to us at the time. But after the fact, we honestly built too big. And there were other ways we could have done it. There were other things we could have done to bridge the gap. So, don't do those things, but do build in phases. Have a master plan, of what this is ultimately going to be. If you end up buying property and you buy 5 acres, which, by the way, I guess that's another thing to kind of talk a little bit about, is buying property.
Isn't that the minimum, 5 acres?
5 acres it's good. It's not, see, we had 3 in Columbus. They still have 3 in Columbus. And that 3 acres of ground they're still okay, Now, there's a couple of houses on it, and if they need to do more in the future, they're probably going to have to demolish those houses to accomplish what they want to accomplish. But they're okay. So if it's a smaller piece of ground, it needs to be pretty symmetric. If it's got an odd shape to it or anything, it's probably going to mess you up. But if it's pretty much a square or a pretty hefty, rectangle that's not way longer than it is wide or whatever, you'll probably be fine on that kind of piece of property. So in my opinion, having experienced it, I'd say 3 acres is about a minimum.
Is there state laws? I know Ohio, you had to have 5 acres.
Well, and that comes into play, of course, if there are certain, laws that require you to have a certain amount of property, then of course you're going to have to abide by those, unless you could acquire a variance, which, that's always a who knows kind of situation. But in terms of just building needs, let's think about this. What would you think, if you look into the future, what are we building for? Well, of course, all of us have that grand dream of, having 1,000 people and, all that kind of stuff. And that's wonderful, and God can do it. But is that probably what's going to happen? Probably not. And if you do get there, then money's not nearly as big of a problem as it is at first, okay? So I would say that if you're going to go and try to, do the perfect situation, if you could buy 5 acres, that's a pretty good piece of property. If you could buy 5 acres. Okay? Then on this 5 acres of ground, you come up with a master plan of how you're going to use that 5 acres of ground. So you got your entrance coming in here, and then you shoot off this way, and you shoot off this way, and here's a parking lot, and over on this side is a parking lot, and here's your first building that you're going to build, and then here's the next one that you're going to build, and here's the next section of it. And you plan it out in phases to allow for your growth. It is true most of the time that if you were able to put all this under roof, that ultimately you'd be saving some money, because building materials are going to go up. But if you have debt on all that, and you're paying interest on all that, unless you are pretty confident you're going to pay it off in a year or two, the interest will quickly overtake what the building materials are going to increase. So this idea, which has been used a lot, of let's just go ahead and, we don't have to finish it all right now, let's just go ahead and put everything under roof, because it's just going to get more expensive to build in the future. That idea is true, but it's not a valid argument unless you know you'll pay the debt off quickly, because the interest will quickly overtake that difference, and the interest will just keep on going and keep on going and keep on going until the thing's paid off. So you can't, again, it's not a wrong thought, but there's other factors that have to be considered. So why not just come out here and build what you absolutely have to have right now? I mean, I wish with everything that's within me that at Nineveh we had built just an auditorium. I wish we'd done that. We were meeting up there on the hill in that house, and we were using that total bottom level for classes, and then ultimately our family moved out of that house, and so the whole thing was available. And we could have come out there on the end of that house. The basement needed some repair. We probably should have invested about $10,000 getting that basement straightened out to where it didn't have any water problems or anything like that. And we could have come right out on the end of that house and built a 50 by 50 building, and it would have been so simple because it wouldn't have had to have hardly any interior walls, just were for your bathrooms and stuff like that, and kept using that house for the classrooms. And we could have come out there, and for about $80,000, it would have been simple to get volunteer labor for. What we built, you couldn't get volunteer labor for it until we got to the inside structure. And even that was kind of overwhelming because it was so big. And so if we had just come out there, we could have got volunteer labor, we could have planned that thing out. Those people would have, over 200 people would have showed up, because this is exactly what happened at Columbus. Over 200 people would have showed up. In one day, that thing would have been completely under roof. And at the end of the week, when people pulled out, all we would have had left to do is finish drywall, paint, and get carpet down. I mean, that's basically where we would have been in that type of a project. That's what we should have done. It's easy to say that now, but that's what we should have done. We should have just built what we needed. That size auditorium, we could have seated 150 people in that size auditorium. We would have been fine. And we could have got, if it was the Lord's will, then we would have room to get up to 150. Probably more, because you've got children's programs and stuff like that going on. So they're over here, so maybe in an auditorium to seat 150, you get close to 200 in attendance. Well, then there would have been more money available. And with more money available, we could have kept working on a master plan and got, then, well, now let's go down the hill and build, this or that.
The Jewels Team Church Initiative.
Absolutely.
Sure.
So
That's what they do. They rent that stadium out. They couldn't build a building that they need for what and they rent the stadium out for millions of dollars, over
Right.
so many years. They couldn't build something, to cover that.
well, and then let me give you one more thought. Because, and I just met somebody, I read this book, and I can't remember the guy's name, Bob something, wrote a book entitled When God Builds a Church. And it's a really good book. If you haven't read it, you need to read it. When God Builds a Church. And in that book, he reveals 8 things that he thinks is involved when God builds a church. Well, this guy, they're Christian, Disciples of Christ church. But when he went, it's in Louisville, Kentucky, and when he went there in 1967, a group of about 60 people were meeting in a basement when he went there in 1967. Now, that church runs over 18,000. And in the book, he talks about, he doesn't go into a lot of detail, but he talks about how they built and built and built and built, and they outgrew their campus. So they had to totally relocate, buy new land, and build and build and build and build, and outgrew that campus, and had to totally relocate. During his ministry, 3 complete relocations, and they're running thousands of people. And so they go and build this other monster of a building, okay? Well, they finally came to a point, which if you're running thousands of people, this is a little bit easier to think this way, but they finally came to a point that said, no more buildings. This is, we don't need to just keep building something that'll hold more people. We need to go out here and start more churches around the city is what we need to do. And so instead of relocating and getting a bigger campus, they started sending people out to start new churches. Okay, now my question is, why not that mentality way sooner before we get to that size? Why not have that way of thinking and that mentality? And so if you think, okay, if we got to 500, we'd be a big church. Because our mentality is not going to be, just keep going, see how far we can go. Our mentality is going to be, send people over here and start another church, send people over here and start another church. So if we ever got to 500, we'd be big. That'd be a big church. Okay, well, you can do a lot on 5 acres of ground. I mean, I'm thinking about our building there in Indianapolis is the nicest building in the APA. I guarantee you. I've been in churches of ours that run over 1,000 people, and they don't have a building like we have. I mean, it is a nice building. And when you think about the way it's situated there on the property, we're not even using a third of that property. There's 18 acres there. And if you just take and go on the other side of that parking lot and draw a line straight back, which we're not even using all that back there, but I mean, we're probably using about 5 to 6 acres of that ground right now with that incredibly nice building. Adequate parking. Now, if you were running 600 or 700, you'd have to have a little bit more parking. But adequate parking, that big playground space back behind there, there's plenty of ground. So you can get a long ways on 5 acres. A long ways. So 5 acres, map it out, build in phases. That's what they should have done in Indianapolis. They should have built part of that building and got it under control financially.
Same idea, let's get it all on the roof.
Exactly. Exactly. And again, part of it, and I don't mean to be, critical, because people have good hearts, And part of it was also, well, man, once we build this, I mean, we'll be able to do this in the gym, and we'll be able to do that, and have this program and that program, and they saw a group of 300 people saw big growth. Well, it didn't happen. In fact, it went backwards instead. So that's another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about trying to avoid debt, being very, very careful about it, is church business is unpredictable. It's very unpredictable. And you could be riding a high and, people decide they're not going to do the right thing, and then you could take a dive. Well, if you've got yourself overwhelmed with debt where it takes all these people and their offerings to keep it going, then that's a bad situation to be in. You can't afford to think how much, if we push it to the edge, how much can we afford? You can't afford to think that way. You've got to say, let's be careful about this. Let's not put ourselves in this situation. And I guess all of that is kind of the least important thing, but it ends up getting made the most important thing. And, this is a great tool, but it doesn't have any power to change any lives. The gospel has power to change lives. And I don't think we can say it doesn't matter at all because of the culture we live in. It does matter to some extent. And especially Midwestern culture. You read these stories about those guys out in California meeting in tents and all that kind of stuff. Well, praise God, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to meet in a tent. Yeah. good luck when January rolls around. And maybe good luck when June rolls around. Because of this Midwestern culture of people saying, I'm not going to church in a tent. What are you talking about? You have to think about it to some extent. You have to think about it. I still think that here in the Midwest, a building's important. And it's a needed tool. But you don't have to go crazy. I've been guilty of going crazy. You don't have to go crazy. You can build what you need with a plan for what you'll do in the future as you need it. And if you'll keep it the smaller it is, the more help you're going to get building it. The more money you're going to save because of that help that you got. And also, it kind of puts your people in a situation that they have to struggle. And that's okay. It's okay for them to have to struggle. They shouldn't feel like, oh wow, we just instantly got this incredible building, that we didn't have to do a whole lot to get. They should sense that struggle. And so, having done it 3 times, 2 times completely from scratch, and comparing what we did, it's far better to build small, just build what you need, take it a step at a time, be very careful, keep the debt as low as possible. Let your people struggle to take care of this. Don't expect money's just going to fly from everywhere. Let them take care of it. And they'll appreciate it a lot more. If they had to invest, if they had to, sweat, they'll appreciate it a lot more. So, that's a very simplistic view of it. There's probably a lot of other little caveats that could come into play in different locations and different areas. But in general, I think that's pretty good advice. Okay. Man, no way did I mean to spend that much time talking about buildings, but I did. I want to talk to you about, now remember that what we've been talking about here is the birth stage. Now, in your birth stage, your meeting places are just those rented facilities. Okay, it's not really talking about the building, which that's where I ended up spending a lot of time because I got ahead of myself actually and started talking to you about stuff that actually happens in the completion stage. But we get our rented facility, and the next thing that we talk about, and we won't be able to talk much about this, but the body stage. So we've had conception, birth, and body. This is the stage where this group of people really begins to gel together. They really begin to become what's described in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12. And they kind of get it. They make this transition from, just a group of people worshiping together to a body that's doing church life together. And there's a big difference. I mean, you can have a pretty, like your Sunday morning only crowd, Well, when you first start, again, unless you're blessed to have some seed families, that's kind of what everybody is. They're just your, you know them, you worship with them, they're nice people, but that's about it. But then as people start taking on responsibility, as they start feeling like this is my church and God's using me here to do something, that sense of body begins to develop and grow. So what we need to talk about in this section is we need to talk about how do we receive members, how do we assimilate people into the church, and how do we raise up leaders. And next time, we'll talk about all of those things, as well as going into the completion stage. Since I've already talked about lands and buildings, we won't have quite as much to cover there. And we'll wrap things up next week. So, be looking forward to that. Lord, thank you so much for church planters, for people who have felt your call, have surrendered to that call, and have gone out where there's nothing and let you use them to start one of your churches. And Lord, I pray for these men, if this is a calling that you have on their life in the future, that they'll be able to look back to these moments in the classroom and be able to say, man, I remember that. And it'll be helpful to them, Lord. And Father, if this is not your calling on their life, I pray that as they see others going and doing it, that they'll realize the sacrifice and the unique situations that they're encountering, and they'll be able to be a good, prayerful supporter for our church planters. Lord, we do pray that many, many new churches would be started. There's not nearly enough. And Lord, we pray for that, for lots of churches to be planted. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.